Welcome to Cinema Cartography.
This video is sponsored by Mubi. Mubi is a curated online cinema streaming exceptional films from around the globe. For your extended free trial, go to mubi.com/cinemacartography. Have we forgotten to look at our dreams? Within all of us lies some lack of resolve. For some, our lives as a whole are manifested as remorse, a self-reproach for what we may have been or who we may have become. The torment is that this deluge of doubt seems to have no end. We do not possess the ability to answer the thoughts and feelings that plague us, make us paralytic in carrying on our lives in hope of gaining some clarity of the future. We hold on to the present moment and become stagnant creatures, existing in a perpetual cycle of uncertainty. Yet I must ask again, have we forgotten to look at our dreams? Andrei Tarkovsky proposed that within all of us lies the answer to that lack of remorse, but we must learn how to access it through dreams, memory, and perspectives that we once thought were impossible to apprehend. Tarkovsky's mystic filmmaking is one that offers a sense of clarity, a unifying force within all of us. If we examine his work chronologically, we can converse with the artist himself as he speaks to us about his philosophy through an almost healing form of cinema. The notion of an obtuse melancholia perhaps is intrinsic to those who have a deeper introspection. However, we can use that introspection to our advantage. As Tarkovsky displays, the only manner in which life can be lived with true fulfillment is to look within. From beginning to end, Tarkovsky expounded on a handful of ideas, but these few ideas made up the entirety of his artistic journey, resulting in one of the most powerful cinematic messages managing to span an artist's entire filmography. To examine the filmography of Tarkovsky is a curious thing to begin at the first work in his chronology. As one may anticipate with most auteurs, Ivan's childhood is the least characteristic of all his work. We find glimpses of many ideas which would later be expanded upon and emblemized as Tarkovskian, as well as many more that would be abandoned from his vision. To take a step back and look at it within the context of Tarkovsky as an auteur, Ivan's childhood displays a degree of self-discovery more so than any of his other films. Seeds are planted and an idiomatic vocabulary is slowly revealed. In rewatching Ivan's childhood, what we find is a genesis. Based on the novella Ivan by Vladimir Bogomolov, the journey of Ivan's childhood follows a young boy whose family has been massacred by Nazis. We see war's harsh realization through the powerful juxtaposition of witnessing its atrocities through the eyes of a child. Tarkovsky claimed he did this to convey his hatred of war, and that childhood is what most contrasts war. Ivan is a broken boy who shares closer camaraderie with the adults around him than he would any other child. Watching the missions he must undertake, Tarkovsky presents us with a story that is both elliptical and whose chronology becomes more and more questionable as time begins to erode all things. I find it difficult to acknowledge the importance of Ivan's childhood without alluding to its otherness in regard to Tarkovsky's repertoire, and as we aim to garner some idea of a timeline, I think it's best to discuss this film's Tarkovskian disparities first. What we find with Ivan's childhood is something which would later completely contrast with Tarkovsky's filmography, and that is a deep-rooted and evident sense of cinematic inspiration. In the early 1960s, many Soviet war films emerged that didn't focus on the combat of war, but turned their attention towards the internal struggles of its soldiers. The period in the USSR, known as the Khrushchev Thaw, allowed more relaxed laws on censorship. Many films of this caliber were thus produced during this period, and Ivan's childhood finds itself in the same vein as many of these, most notably the 1958 Palme d'Or winner The Cranes Are Flying, in its depiction of a collective psyche under the duress of warfare. Tarkovsky, being enamoured by The Cranes Are Flying, was so impressed by the director of photography Sergei Rozhevsky that Ivan's Childhood was shot so that it would look as though they used the same cinematographer. The highly choreographed sequences of Ivan's Childhood were done in a manner as such that they would be almost indistinguishable from Rozhevsky's work. The sequences themselves are fantastic, however it's more interesting to see Tarkovsky develop his cinematic language based around such kinship with his fellow filmmakers, as what would later come to define his style is a stark cinematic individuality. Tarkovsky's filmmaking is a very personal style of storytelling. To dwell on what rests solely within you meant that a unique language was not only a necessity, it was entwined with the methodology. Therefore, Tarkovsky rarely looked to others in cinema to inspire his work, and the idea that he would use someone else's lexicon to explain his unique perspective would not be revisited again. Yet we still witness the archetypical artist journey of Tarkovsky, that gradual unfolding of technique and ideas until they fuse as a unique voice. Ivan's Childhood exemplifies this starting point, and to truly understand the journey of Tarkovsky as an auteur, we must recognise that there is so much present within Ivan's Childhood which became antithetical to his later work. Tarkovsky was always a filmmaker that was consciously present within his own artistic method. He was able to discuss his techniques with lucidity. A notable declaration was on his usage of symbols and symbology. Tarkovsky aimed at an inward-facing cinema, one where definitive meaning was neglected for a more poetic coherence. The idea of symbology to him was an absolute intellectualization of cinema, thus a removal of its soul, going even as far as to declare himself the enemy of symbols. These notions are an apropos descriptor of his work. However, when we look at Ivan's Childhood, there's a discrepancy. An element at play here not present in the rest of Tarkovsky's work are strong denotative meanings. Ivan's Childhood holds a very conscious element to the image, which perhaps may remain metaphorical, yet it comes with a strong intellectualization of the work. There are images and actions within Ivan's Childhood which come with very specific intentions. This is normal when we discuss cinematic language, however it's at a contrast when measured against the rest of Tarkovsky's work. With Ivan's Childhood, large portions of the film are analogous to the cinema of neorealism. There's the thematic similarities, such as the internal focus amidst large-scale outward catastrophes, or looking at this perspective through the eyes of a child. But as a filmmaking process, much of Ivan's Childhood is shot in a realist manner, and there's an attempt to capture emotional subjectivity through these means. We follow characters with handheld cameras. Tarkovsky conveys discomfort between the space of subject and spectator as it becomes very cramped. We move in closer when made aware of the rising tension that the film and action instigates. When relevant information rises, we creep inwards. And the POVs hold the essence of a character's emotion, displaying both elation and fear. As we see through the literal eyes of our characters, the camera must avert its own from atrocities. Neorealist cinema was a politically charged movement, and thus its filmmaking methods were highly intellectualized to the degree of its conveyance. Because of this, the symbolism and metaphors are meant to be hidden, but when you actively attempt to hide something, often the result is an even keener emphasis on it. In essence, the language that Tarkovsky adopted was a very intrusive style of filmmaking, as much of neorealism was. Many shots and sequences here cannot be mistaken for anything else. They are meant to evoke tension, mystery, etc. These went against Tarkovsky's want to express indefinite meanings through his cinema, resulting in un-Tarkovskyan elements. For Tarkovsky, his philosophies remain true. However, whether through a lack of cinematic vocabulary to express, or the fear of jeopardizing his own work by going too far with these techniques, it would appear that Tarkovsky made compromises. Yet all this is not to say that Ivan's Childhood is a failure as a film by any means. In fact, if the rest of Tarkovsky's work wasn't so stellar, Ivan's Childhood would probably be a more well-remembered film. But what is now more interesting to discuss are the seeds that were planted, exposing the beginnings of one of the greatest cinematic minds to ever exist. Ivan's Childhood works in the same manner as Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. The deeper we go, the closer we get to a truth we find more and more incomprehensible. The film opens with one of its many dream sequences, and like many dreams, they go unexplained. But as we venture deeper within the film, these dreams become a motif and manifest into something more. Their depth is boundless. However, we must never apply a real logic to them, for they do not obey the same rules as us. They have endless meaning, yet in simultaneous contradiction to themselves. A dream is only a dream, a drastic and harsh split away from reality. What you would call the realist parts of Ivan's Childhood, those outside of the dreams, are entrenched within the material perspectives of people. We never abandon seeing the world through the eyes of someone who is physically there. The film tells itself in a very subjective manner of those present. The camera remains close to them so that we can see their stories. But in Ivan's dreams, we slowly begin to disassociate. We see Ivan within a situation and then observe him from outside of it, the camera often displaying him more than once in the shot, as though witnessing yourself from your own subconscious. In this scene, it's manifested as Ivan looking down at himself through a well. This is something that Tarkovsky would become known for, this perspective, this complete degree of unreality. You could almost class it as perfect objectivity. We begin to see ourselves unfiltered through the gaze of anyone else, trapped inside some otherworldly entity which may or may not exist. Tarkovsky treats dreams as a series of repetitions. They are lyrical in nature, with their elements often reiterating something. They're cyclical, as if attempting to reach some deep-seated idea inside you. In this dream sequence with the horse and apple cart, the playing with symbols suggests that there is deeper meaning within here, as it utilises such archetypical symbology. However, this is a transgression in itself. The falling apples imply that meaning exists. However, if we are to seek truth through the reasoning of this, we'll become overwhelmed, as any connections we made would begin to become irrelevant. Like finding a purpose for every fallen apple, there's too much chance and mystery in life that we will never solve it. All we can do is accept it. As is the nature of much of humanity, dreams can, and if not handled properly, will become nightmares. As such, we view the world on this uncertain axis, wherein the internal manifests itself outward. Ivan begins to envision what lies dormant in his mind to the world around him. As his dreams become more ethereal, the material world is what is impacted the most. It's through the progression of Ivan's childhood that Tarkovsky begins to weave the planes of reality and dreams together, both taking equal footing in the embodiment of our protagonist. His thoughts have just as much power on the person he is as the world around him. The film moves toward a conclusion where the focus is on this aura of the inevitable, for that which is immaterial grows with far more consequence. The situation of Ivan has not altered. However, his soul has become darkened by his destructive thoughts. When your soul is tainted, the earth will always become a swamp. We live by our mind being the internal. What does the end of the world mean when you have no hope, no desires, where your dreams will go on unfulfilled? We do not fear death, only death of the soul. Tarkovsky shows this with an Earth that embodies a character's state. In the scene where Ivan meets the stranger, the world operates on a completely metaphysical level. The sound, the dialogue, the reactions, everything is not of this reality. It all becomes alien for Ivan, who has no root in this material world. This is what we would call real, yet it operates like any other dream. We escape the subjective and find ourselves totally immersed in the territory of the subconscious. And again, any connections we make are ours and ours alone. Human interference being relayed through the greater fear of falling short of our desires. And that fear we know as the unknown, as the world continues, regardless of our input. The death of Ivan in the mind of the captain signifies the full shift in the vision of Tarkovsky. It reaches a moment defining that which blurs the subjective and the objective, of dreams and reality. Ivan is killed, and yet he continues to be. In the world of the film, he lives and continues to live. The dream has become the nightmare, has become the reality, has become the dream. Thus is the axiom of Tarkovsky's vision. For Ivan, this state of existence is just as tangible as the nightmare that was his reality. This is not a spiral towards a conclusion, it's a drift. Tarkovsky begins to create something otherworldly, something outside of our dreams that is intrinsically dreamlike. We are part of something alien, and the images that Tarkovsky surrounds us with, the lyricism of the natural world, is what makes up the entirety of Ivan's being. Everything he was, everything no longer in reach, everything he could have been, everything that others can no longer see in him. Because of this, we can see where the story is ending. The images of what instilled happiness now make us afraid, like a dream, slowly shifting into a nightmare. The final dream of Ivan is exactly what our dreams are. We don't have the ability to foresee where they shall take us if we are to achieve them. But Tarkovsky displays dreams are not arbitrary goals that are to be reached. They're voids within our very being, our regret, our isolation, everything that we could and perhaps should have been. As Ivan finally reaches the tree within his dream is the moment that the film ends, and to us, the moment he ceases to exist. There still remains a connection with memory in the presentation of Ivan's childhood, and though many elements are derived from other Soviet filmmakers of the time, moments like this are lingering on a broken cross as the light pierces through the mist, allows for a deep moment of reflection, to focus on the very absence of image, stripping its elements for the purest of inward movements. Although Ivan's childhood came at a time when it was placed alongside other realist films, its roots lay in the poetic realism of something like Letterland. And it's that poetry and lyrical nature of his work that would not only be remembered, but go on to shape everything he did thereafter. To re-watch Ivan's childhood is to examine the prelude to the man's unquestioned cinematic sovereignty. Andrei Rublev was Tarkovsky's second film and marked his first masterpiece. His first and only forte into creating a biopic film, the world of Andrei Rublev is set in one of the darkest eras in Russian history, the Middle Ages, where most of what anybody knew was misery and destruction. But in the same vein of utter individualism that would come to define Tarkovsky, Andrei Rublev is a piece under no cinematic influence. It's completely its own, even eschewing what one would assume to be cinematic norms of being a biopic. The idea of creating a film around one of Russia's most infamous medieval painters would lend some to assume that by the film's conclusion, a greater perspective would have been gained of the artist, and perhaps there may be some slight modicum of grander understanding of the man's work. However, this was not the case, and Tarkovsky knew this from the beginning. The real-life Andrei Rublev is etched within history as one of Russia's most important artists. However, to this day, much of the painter's personal life remains a mystery. As a result, the film is loosely based on the life of Andrei Rublev, the majority of the narrative being constructed by Tarkovsky himself, as the specificity of what to base Andrei Rublev's life on didn't exist. The film is split into 8 distinct episodes, bookended by both the prologue and epilogue, none of which are logically connected. Tarkovsky utilised this ability of dramatic freedom to expound on a poetic meditation much more powerful than he was capable of when making Ivan's childhood. The structure of Andrei Rublev is of an internal connection, not one where the dramaturgy is a concrete foundation of cause and effect, but one wherein associations are made as trains of thought. And perhaps the reason for all of this can be explained in the film's untitled opening chapter. The opening to Andrei Rublev is never explained nor referred to again throughout the film, but it sets the precedent for how this film is to be viewed and experienced. An Icarus type of character takes flight in a hot air balloon, whilst an angry crowd attempts to disrupt the flight. The man takes off and is entranced in a euphoric state as we switch to his POV and sail above, looking down at the town below him. His exhilaration captures the simultaneous sense of awe and terror of a literal rising above the people, closer to becoming a deity. All of this before he crashes back to Earth. There's an almost perfect correlation between this and the opening from Fellini's 8½, where we see a filmmaker played by Fellini himself soaring into his own dreams before being pulled back to Earth by the people around him. In some sense, the introduction to Andrei Rublev has nothing to do with the remainder of the film, yet it's the perfect and only way to begin. Tarkovsky in this instance displays something of an edict for the remainder of his works. His films are purely experiential. Imagine the astonishment of the man flying through the air. He would have been the only man in the world to have seen that. He's flown and seen the world from a vantage point of no other human. We rise with him and are removed from the world as we know it, or as anyone knows it, to discover a new realm of unrelation and inner growth. We drift alongside this man. We do not know his name nor his story, but as Tarkovsky lingers on his perspective, we in essence become this man. Our lives and his fuse. As we see his greatest culmination manifest in front of us, Tarkovsky allows us to remove the intellectual and focus on the inner. Not on the real, but on something we've not accessed. Something within. This is and would become the basis of Tarkovsky's filmmaking. Much like the man in the balloon sequence, when you experience it, you become less in touch with reality, but you get a better view of it all. If there were to be any scene that could hold the foundation of Tarkovsky's philosophy, it would be this one. For the first time, Tarkovsky was able to create a film whose construction was a completion of the overtonal montage theorem put forth by Eisenstein. The scenes were constructed in a manner of emotional composition. Andrei Rublev was the first of Tarkovsky's pieces, wherein if one were to attempt to analyse the film's thematics through a critical lens, one would find that the closest you would get to a complete understanding lies solely in the experiential. Whatever each scene conjures inward is what the scene itself is, and the image becomes the greatest metaphor for life. The narrative is the atmosphere. As we see in the first chapter of the film, the camera pans around the room and conjures an ambience of ambiguity. Accepting that mystery is all we can discover is the only way to gain true understanding. The episodic nature of Andrei Rublev is consistent with the inner workings of Rublev himself, a journey of his personal evolution for the inception of his ideas. Therefore, the removal of the restrictions held by the formalism of a more logical pattern of filmmaking are avoided. But for what greater purpose? Why was it necessary for Tarkovsky to take this approach? Well, perhaps it's in the questioning of one's own art that this film could have even been made. Andrei Rublev acts as the protagonist, but what we find is not what we anticipated. We find a man who is passive, wherein the events that happen neither directly affect him, nor are influenced by him. There are many parts of these episodes in which the titular character doesn't appear, and many more where the story exists to tell what's occurring parallel to the life of Rublev. Even towards the finale and most climactic scenes, Rublev chooses to take a vow of silence and doesn't speak for the final third of the film, up until the very end. This technique of an unimposing perspective will be even further expounded upon by Tarkovsky in his following work, but here it allows us, much like in the opening scene of the balloon, to become one with Rublev. He's not a man whose perspective is chained to any static entity. He himself is an icon of Russia, an intrinsic part of Russian identity. Therefore, Tarkovsky needed to be able to capture the entire terrain of the world that was able to birth this man. And so, although we don't follow Rublev on an intimate level, we see a story from a perspective more encompassing of his status as a human incarnation of Russia. A major discussion from Tarkovsky and Andrei Rublev is the impact that art has on individuals and the world it inhabits. Although we never see him painting the works he's renowned for, we know Rublev for his ability to comprehend the ephemeral meaning of the time he lived in, and to express that through his art, an intrinsic sensibility that seems to come with being a painter. In Andrei Rublev, we examine the nature of beauty, discovering that it can and often will emerge from grief and disaster. Just as Rublev himself did in his art, Tarkovsky aims to imitate. In a world of such terrifying consequence, Tarkovsky reminds us of the incredible wonder of introspection. Even those things that cause intense ruin can be the same things that produce an otherworldly radiance. The magnificent work of Andrei Rublev was only capable of being produced in a nightmarish milieu of horrors many of us couldn't even bear to witness. Tarkovsky's work, then, is perhaps the same mediation on finding beauty in the chaos as what is professed in The Third Man, although maybe a more hopeful one. Tarkovsky decided to make his second film about the life of an icon painter. I'm sure the irony of his task struck him rather quickly. If Andrei Rublev painted icons, then we also have to call Tarkovsky an icon painter. Perhaps his tools differ, but the method remains. The camera of Tarkovsky creates a subjectivity of Rublev, yet not one immediately identifiable. The camera does remain distinctly separate from him. In the opening chapter, Rublev is present, yet the camera hovers around the room before he enters. We as viewers see things in ways that he cannot. The camera passes from the interior to the exterior. We spend long periods learning more about other people's intentions than we do of his own. If we were seeing the subjective perspective of anything throughout the film, it would be Rublev's subconscious, drifting through a world that will mould him on a far deeper level. And so as an artist himself, Tarkovsky reflects on what purpose art has in the world, as well as the paradoxical nature of being an artist. In Andrei Rublev, Tarkovsky aimed to display that Christianity was an axiom of the Russian identity. In doing so, his own declaration of faith was expounded upon, and thus came the dichotomy shared by both Tarkovsky the filmmaker and Rublev the painter. Does your art have any truth? What does it have to offer? Both Rublev and Tarkovsky represent artists that do not exist within a vacuum. They exist as products of their time, capturing impressions of the consciousness of all of society. Their relationship to their epoch is that they are the pinnacle of its imagination. Both Rublev and Tarkovsky in some way avoid the intellectual with their work, opting to work on more spiritual realms of thought. Yet this in itself is paradoxical, for to claim something to be truth, even a subjective truth, must come with some level of objectivity. It's truth with a capital T. It may even be a divine truth. And if all you expound upon is a truth that was already decided before you, then who is your art for?
Все друг на друга грехи сваливать начнут, выгораживаться перед Вседержителем.
И как ты с такими мыслями писать можешь, не понимаю. Восхваление еще принимаешь.
Here we see the contradiction. If your work is for the benefit of mankind, it cannot solely be your own perspective. It would render all your work irrelevant. However, if you're working on the premise of someone else's imposed objective morality, then your mind and power is not your own, and to work on your own mind is an incongruity in itself. The idea of knowledge becomes a moot point.
Во многой мудрости много печали.
И кто умножает познание, умножает скорбь.
The artist inexplicably chases the darkness, only to find himself caught in the flames of instability. But as we learn amidst the journey that Andrei Rublev takes, we know where it ends. His vow of silence in the film's final hour is an act of futility. He aims to no longer influence the world around him, as if his words would have had any impact at all. Whether he uses his voice or not, the world is still what enforces itself upon him. Only at the finale of the film does he break his vow, to repent against the chastity against his art, promising he will value his ability. We follow this with the film cutting to colour for the first and only time, finally presenting us with the real-life works of Andrei Rublev. But rather than display his icons in all their majesty, Tarkovsky shows us impressions, details, not the entire picture, but fragments. And we move towards these fragments until we reach the whole, the most famous of Rublev's work. The sequence allows us to remove ourselves from the immediacy of Rublev's life to contextualize it to our own. These glimpses of his work are the same as the glimpses of his life, the episodic nature that Tarkovsky implemented. The direct connections are not there, but no matter how you examine his life, the result always ends the same. Tarkovsky teaches us that we're able to view life through any means. Many connections we make are fortuitous, as whatever conclusions we reach shall always be the same. And in regards to art, the art we make will long outlive us, becoming icons in itself. All art that lasts should be appreciated with deep reflections, as they tell a story rooted in the entirety of the human condition. The final shot of the film is a group of horses. Tarkovsky said that horses to him represented life, and that was the source of all of Rublev's art. But what I think he neglected to mention is that it was also the source of all his own. Andrei Rublev became the true archetype for what Tarkovsky's work would become. Here we find a true admiration for landscape. The very real material becomes almost inescapable from art itself. There still remains something poetic about blazing fires, snow falling indoors, bodies consumed by the elements. It acts as two organic materials that are so often at war, our lives with the natural world, as if we are not natural ourselves. But with Tarkovsky, they're accepted by one another. The landscapes themselves hold a lyricism, they repeat and appear to be endless. There is again a continuing dreamlike and almost alien quality to them, but our characters do not look at the landscape. They barely even interact or acknowledge what's around them. It reaches something metaphysical. A strange dance between the environment and the characters ensues. They communicate to one another whilst not communicating at all, remaining completely separate. And one can't help but feel as though the motif of paint running through water is art innately transfusing with the world itself. Tarkovsky, for the first time in Andrei Rublev, showed worlds that were simultaneously in the background as well as on the same plane as us. He shoots his settings in very deep focus. The world stretches beyond the subjects, implying that the world is both inseparable from them as they are from it. In Ivan's childhood, the film's kinetic energy came from the camera. It moved with a much more frantic pace. However, when I think of Tarkovsky's images, I think of a lot of movement, but this time, it's the world itself that develops that kinesis. These seeds were sown in his previous film, however now, he approaches it in a far more transient manner. The world grows and decays to give it a level of impermanence and yet eternality. Things occur without the character's input at all, the same way Andrei Rublev himself will be impacted whether he chooses to or not. We learn that our journey will continue. Regardless of what we do, these things will remain. And like the countless leaves that fall from the trees, our story is just one of the endless stories occurring simultaneously in this nebulous thing called life. Andrei Rublev was pulled from many places by the Soviet government upon its release, making it ineligible for public viewing in Russia for over 20 years. This just added one more parallel between Tarkovsky and the focus of his second film. He used the past to speak of the present. He called upon the historical values of medieval Russia to expound on the values of today. An artist by nature is tendentious. Whatever they say expresses some kind of displeasure with the world we currently inhabit. He fashioned the world of Andrei Rublev whether it occurred or not, just as how Rublev himself fashions his own life. He dreams conversations with his dead mentor. In his mind, Jesus is fashioned as a Russian martyr in the Middle Ages. But as we've already learned, dreams are not things to be achieved. They manifest the life we are to lead, always falling short if we demand and expect answers from it. Perhaps this was accurate to the life of Andrei Rublev, but as with every person that will ever live, their lives only exist in the minds of those living. What is it to be alive? What is it that makes us human? This is the central concept that Tarkovsky handles in Solaris. Solaris follows Chris Kelvin, who's sent on an interstellar journey to a planet of the same name. The planet hovers over an alien plane called the Ocean. We learn that a now retired pilot of a previously exploratory team that was on the station near Solaris had an encounter with a being that appeared to emerge from the ocean itself. Kelvin is sent to the station to examine the situation. Upon arrival, he discovers that one of the current team members has committed suicide due to things that he saw in the ocean. It appears that the ocean has an ability to dive deep within the soul of people and externalize it to them. For Kelvin, this manifests as his dead wife. Gradually, Kelvin begins to treat her as if she was still alive, questioning what makes her her, as she begins to also question the existential reality of her own existence. Solaris is arguably the most existential of all Tarkovsky's work, particularly when examined at the metaphysical level, asking us about the importance of our consciousness and what the purpose is of our humanity. When watching Tarkovsky's work chronologically, the beginning of Solaris seems to pick up exactly where we left off with Andrei Rublev. We open in the magnificence of earthly delights. The camera zooms in and slowly meanders through the innate mysteries of the organic world. The camera movement has no definitive meaning. However, as it pans across revealing our main character, we realise our mutuality. Kelvin meditates on the beauty of his planet, soothed by its mysteries. He stands in a field where our solutions are not visibly evident, but all the answers are right there within our grasp. A plant is a plant, is also much more, depending on your perspective. This is a notion that remains very strong throughout Solaris. We spend much of the first portion of the film with Kelvin, experiencing a blocked sense of time at his homestead. He's aware that he's going to be leaving, and now every moment is precious and sustained. Such a hardwired feeling of nostalgia is present even when we're still with Kelvin on Earth. The feelings that something as simple as staring at nature evokes here allows us to reflect on the fleetingness of all moments we experience, hoping that we could capture them eternally. And once we leave, all connections made on the station and around Solaris are deeply entwined to what Kelvin yearns for, his life on Earth, that which is the only real. Tarkovsky famously made Solaris in some degree as a response to Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey. He felt as though the level of artifice in 2001 was a distraction from the viewer and disrupted the humanism of the story. As a result, Tarkovsky filmed the more futuristic and scientific elements of Solaris in a very matter-of-fact fashion. The best way of discussing this is to hear it from Tarkovsky himself. Hence the natural elements and things that we may normally find mundane, Tarkovsky discovers the hidden poetry within them. He creates a link between the idea of a connectivity with the Earth and the home for Kelvin, as if we're searching for something purifying in our life, and the only way we're to achieve this is to return to those things which hold an ancient real. They hold a different level of knowledge within them, and just to stare at them, even as viewers, we can sense the memories and lives that they emanate. Tarkovsky contrasts the sequence at the homestead with everything outside of it, the clearest being the highway scene. We travel in a car through tunnels, catching glimpses of a futuristic city. The lights are hypnotic, and the elements are often a lot more bombastic than with other elements that Tarkovsky shoots. But this time, the atmosphere created is an imposing one. It creates something unwelcoming. This is because what Solaris combats against is the conflicting morality that arises through expansive technological progress. The artificial arises, creating new planes of morality, but all at the cost of a true progression. We feed ourselves a falsehood of advancement, removing our own sense of self. And so this sequence, although containing all of the elements that are anticipated with Tarkovsky's work, the long drawn out shots, the slow moving camera, an overwhelming sense of inertia, it doesn't evoke the simple serenity as raindrops falling in a teacup. For these technological advancements do not liberate us, they isolate and haunt us. The grander part of Solaris ignores the scientific elements to discuss the inner workings of the human soul. The same way he used the past as a vessel for discussing the present with Andrei Rublev, Tarkovsky now uses the future. Just as many of Tarkovsky's previous characters have been shaped by their dreams, Kelvin is shaped by memory. His memories of home make him envision an idealized life that perhaps he may live, and the memories of his wife become manifested by the ocean. In this essence, memories are the only thing that define the self. Initially, Kelvin's deceased wife is created, and Kelvin imprints his own memories onto her. Her next reiteration is filled with her own autobiographical experience. She is now no longer just a projection of Kelvin. Simultaneously, she is just that. She's a greater being's perception of Kelvin's perception of himself. Originally, she was exactly what Kelvin wanted her to be. Then, she was exactly how she was in the mind of Kelvin. And now, she is exactly how she was in her mind, in the mind of Kelvin. The self is not simply one's own consciousness. It's the perception of oneself in the consciousness of others. It's how people perceive the perception of our own perception. In short, Tarkovsky aims to recapture that ethereal objectivity, which seems to underlie so many of his films. Our characters' internal struggle seems to be in finding an unattainable centre, a place wherein all of their turmoil will find resolution. Solaris was the first introduction of Tarkovsky using a character searching for absolute truth in a material way, always resulting in the same ambiguous ending. The film stock itself begins to transmute through all different types of filters and gradings. The film moves from colour to a metallic blue, black and white, and sepia. At first they seem to differentiate a moment in time. However, as we progress, they seem to be solely associated with mood and atmosphere. The warm tones of the sepia that emerge when Kelvin and his wife speak in their quarters feels both warming and distant at the same time. Eventually, these shifts between colours mimic the questionable levels of reality we find ourselves in. Sometimes things can feel like the past, and they can feel like a dream. But if the effect is a reshaping of our souls, they may as well all exist within the same paradigm.
Что значит сообщенные мною сведения почти ничему не соответствуют? Ведь я все это видел своими глазами. Что значит почти?
Solaris is not a film about battling against the unknown, but about battling and confronting the painful experiences that we do know. Tarkovsky's camera is an utterly detached viewpoint which we may often mistake as a character's perspective. In the famous scene where Kelvin and his wife levitate around the room, the same song by Bach plays that was playing in their memory from Earth. As we look at the painting on the wall, this could be the viewpoint of our protagonists. But isn't it likelier that this is the camera merely showing us that these things are? It's clear that there is a distinct similarity to connect this scene with the previous scene on Earth. Yet as Tarkovsky has displayed numerous times, all connections made stem from a limited perspective. We see things as we want to see them, the same way that Kelvin's wife is seen as he wants to see her, even if it only exists in his subconscious. The perspective Tarkovsky offers us is even deeper than the subconscious. It's a plane that perhaps may exist, but we will never be capable of accessing. We view things from within and beyond. We see ourselves within a situation and then from outside of the situation. Just as Kelvin begins to see multiple versions of his wife. They are all his wife. But for the first time, we understand that all these perspectives are necessary to manifest the true her. That which remains unresolved in many of us. The unwillingness to accept the futility of understanding life and holding on to our dreams. At the finale of the film, Kelvin returns to Earth. He regains a sense of home, even though something seems awry. We discover that his home is an island floating within the ocean. This is one of the few times in his career that Tarkovsky is more directly philosophical with the viewer. However, I believe it's very necessary in regards to this work. Kelvin's return to Earth is in a sense a return to the womb. On one level, it's a hero's return. On another, it's a regression. On one level, Kelvin displays the return to the source of all that he is, the closest he can gain to an objective truth. Even after travelling so far, and his journey for truth being taken along a road of technological advancement, his aim to acquire more knowledge led him back to where he started. Just as we saw the dichotomy of the artist in Andrei Rublev, a similar parallel is drawn here. Man wants to be free of any restraints, and yet he will simultaneously seek his own individualist meaning, a perpetual inner conflict. And the way Tarkovsky displays his world is that this abstract knowledge has always been there. We were simply not elevated on a spiritual level, an internal maturity, to access it. But there are also the negative connotations that Solaris suggests. Kelvin accepts his life within the ocean. He chooses to live the fantasy. Perhaps the world that he sees is exactly everything that his subconscious wanted him to see, yet he didn't muster the strength to live it himself. Or perhaps all of life is a solipsistic imagination from our own minds. Tarkovsky shows that we must have belief in something. There must be some value system that we hold true within ourselves. Beyond that, what is a fabrication and what is reality, we shall never know. They may as well all be the same, and in Tarkovsky's vision, they're shown as such. The three main subjects in Tarkovsky's first films all undergo similar arcs, longing to resolve their unanswered troubles, all of them ending at roughly the same location. We'll continue to yearn for some catharsis in the grand discovery of our purpose, but our greater connection to the cosmos will only come through a greater connection with ourselves. Not everything in life is understandable. We're determined to find meaning and purpose in every piece of minutiae, no matter how mundane. Tarkovsky developed his aesthetic style and applied it with no concern to pre-existing cinematic dogma. He gave up on cinema as a medium to tell stories that appease the conscious, seeking to develop a style with the ability to communicate with a world that exists within us. A world of memories of phantasms, that they may compose a unique structure that makes a transparent cinematic view from beginning to end. The fluidity of its dramaturgy may be seen as opaque at first, yet Tarkovsky's images force our eyes open, wider than they've ever been, able to see with clarity a new domain of cinematic possibility for the first time. Mirror is the most characteristic of Tarkovsky's work in regards to filmmaking philosophy. Everything he discusses about his process is present here, which is interesting considering it's also the most succinct of his work. The film is Tarkovsky's most autobiographical, presenting itself along multiple temporal planes interwoven with one another. Phrases from the distant past are interlaced with the future, with often the same actors being used for different characters. Documentary footage plays alongside current events and are presented in the same way that a character's dreams would. In Mirror, time itself is presented as the mirror, that which reflects itself back to us across all levels to display an inward universality. We as humans are made up of nothing but memories. The past exists in the present, for it exists within us at every moment. It's my belief that Tarkovsky truly wanted viewers to progress spiritually in their life by being able to examine their own lives through a lens of deep-seated poetry, one wherein everything will emerge much more harmonious. From the opening scene of Mirror, we see an unrelated sequence of a boy unable to overcome a stutter, until through hypnosis he declares that he can speak. It's a strong suggestion that perhaps Tarkovsky has found his voice, a way to communicate with us how he has exposed the truth and connectivity of all life.
Громко и четко. Я могу говорить, давай.
Я могу говорить.
Tarkovsky utilized elements of Soviet montage theory, those put forth by Kuleshov and Eisenstein, primarily poetic, tonal, and overtonal montage. However, it was in Mirror that his hypothesis on film editing came to full fruition. Tarkovsky's book Sculpting in Time is the most comprehensive look at his work as it comes directly from the source. Here he divulges his images of sound, image, all the elements of mise-en-scène. Yet the core idea for the book's title is the central thesis of his filmmaking. Sculpting in Time is exactly how Tarkovsky perceives his work. Whereas for Eisenstein, concepts and ideas were what dictated the cut, the intellectual. But for Tarkovsky, it's the emotion. And that emotion is manifested through time itself. Time is the unique factor that the cinematic artist plays with. It's not an image trapped in time like photography, and it's not an eternal image external from time through the containment of an abstract frame like sculpture. Time is what is captured in Mirror, time that's moulded, shaped, and reconstructed. Time holds all the emotional states that one can experience. Much like how Kelvin is hypnotized by the nature around his home in Solaris, these answers are in front of our eyes, just not in the material world. It is thus in Tarkovsky's mind the filmmaker's job not to create these emotions, but to find the correct means of exposing them. The time is internal to the image itself, and the filmmaker must work with what he has. The main thesis of Tarkovsky is the gathering of this time and then creating a mosaic of this material through the construction of a film. Time is captured on micro scales within individual shots and scenes. The motion of the camera is only dictated through the passage of time, once the mood of a shot allows it to take its natural course. We want to wait with the child in fear. As the relief slowly hits us, we must move upward.
Она же учебная.
Only time allows us to feel this. These microcosms are then constructed into a macro scale of time in which the entire piece is put together. Only after staying with the mother long enough are we permitted an understanding of her home and ultimately her life. Only then can we move through the home, slowly but inevitably. These shots hold a logic, and they exist in an incredibly complex framework, but they are never to be explained. While the juxtaposition of shots through montage produce intellectual links, Tarkovsky's rhythm of his time images expose something much more significant about the essence of life. It's most appropriate that Tarkovsky would highlight these techniques most as his most autobiographical film, for these poetic insights express to its greatest ability the individuality of Tarkovsky as a person through his art. Being a narrative that's inspired from Tarkovsky's own life, we can assume that the images presented to us in Mirror are images of memory. These memory images are places in a cinematic world of time. They're presented to us as one unified piece, but fragmented in a chronology that unfolds more like a dream. The way that Tarkovsky orchestrates his shots is what develops this sense of pressure of time, to feel the essence of time bleeding through the image.
Ой, я, кажется, не туда попала.
What we end up seeing are images that feel both real and unreal. Impressions from inside the filmmaker's mind projected to us through the context of an entire lifetime of meaning. Everything we see here led Tarkovsky to exactly where he is now, and yet there seems to be no clear indication of anything that would have caused such a thing, thus emphasizing the importance of dreams to Tarkovsky. These are his dreams. They're also his life. If this is how he sees his life, does that not make it real? The same way characters see the world through mirrors, the way the light refracts off them, that is memory, an image painted with the light of our own perceptions. The techniques of Tarkovsky in Mirror are at its most non-physical. Every element of mise-en-scène here serves a bodiless form. The camera hovers around scenes detached from any specific individual. The soundscapes are typically silent, with only the subtle sounds of the elements at play: fire burning, water dripping. Life never plays out as the real. We float, we exist in black and white, we move in slow motion. The real and material are reflected in this conceptual mirror, as if what is reflected becomes materialized into a new kind of real, a new form of materiality. Tarkovsky's methods may exist to make things seem distant from reality, yet it's a coalescence of every kind of knowledge we have fused together, manifesting a new kind of physical image. Mirror could be the most organic form of cinematic storytelling ever conceived. It's not held down by any kind of cinematic dogma and emerges to create a genuinely new and fulfilling experience. When Tarkovsky organizes the structure of Mirror to coincide with his philosophy of sculpting in time, his camera creates a temporal clarity of each shot. These multitudes of time are then allowed to interplay with one another, creating a response from the viewer that's not within the mind, but somewhere more visceral. I've chosen not to describe the story of Mirror, for that I believe is against the way that one should view the film. It is, in its truest sense, a film about life. And much like life, to explain what their life is about is to do a disservice to the nuance that makes that person who or what they are. Mirror is an amalgam of perception, history, memory, and dreams, the fabric which is weaved together forming everything about one's life that is. Nothing requires significance. A mark left on a table is just that. Regardless of everything else that occurred around it, that was the one thing you chose to remember. That alone is significant in itself. We can view our lives from multiple angles, and ultimately so can others. But Tarkovsky views life as a whisper. Parts may seem louder than others, but they all stay there, lingering in the back of our minds, always in the present. And even if we try to push them away, they'll still be there, sinking into us, becoming everything around us, like gifts for the earth. Stalker is a film of the earth, a film whose palette is coaxed with organic material, and one wherein we must abide by the laws of that which may or may not be there. The plot of Stalker is possibly Tarkovsky's most straightforward, and in a narrative sense plays out as a typical plot, even with some archetypical characters. However, being a Tarkovsky adaptation, this simply acts as the framework for what becomes a highly spiritual meditation on one's life. I'm sure that many would argue that even the act of watching Stalker is more of a religious experience in itself.
Пусть исполнится то, что задумано. Пусть они поверят.
The film takes place in some kind of future, whether dystopian, post-apocalyptic, or perhaps even some other dimension. We're never really told when and where the film takes place. We follow an unnamed man who holds the film's titular title of Stalker. His job is to guide two men whom we only come to know as Professor and Writer to a place in the enigmatic area of the Zone. After the striking of a meteorite, the Zone became completely uninhabited by all, except perhaps by the Zone itself. And there are rumours of a room that lie there, that if you manage to traverse to it, all your innermost desires shall be fulfilled. However, all these rumours and myths may lead us to a question. Is the room real? And in fact, is the Zone real? Understanding the whole of Stalker is no simple task. It's peak Tarkovsky, and the slowest of all his work. And even though the narrative is a transgression of the hero's journey, Tarkovsky's use of image negates the traditional storytelling of cinema. Stalker displays not only Tarkovsky's fascination with the earth, but as if the image sinks into the earth itself. The muddy aquatic images that paint the canvas of Stalker are the most dense images of all of Tarkovsky's films. At one moment, Stalker sinks into the grass of the Zone, almost as if to feel the heartbeat of the world. Our equivalent to this is displayed in something like the dream sequence, in which the camera pans along the ground as the immense time pressure of the scene builds the mystery of the world. Algae floats on the surface of the calm water, as debris and soil and stone are brushed aside. Underneath the surface lie human items, memories, things almost encased in time, much like how Kelvin sits inside the ocean of Solaris. Here we're invited to contemplate, the image metamorphosing that knowledge is not a membrane to pass through, it's a river, ever changing. The words spoken in the scene progressively fade away, illustrating the lack of importance explanation has at a moment like this. The image trumps all, with everything else empty in meaning. If Mirror emphasised more than any other work of Tarkovsky the relevance of time, then Stalker, more than any other, shows the relevance of space.
Пустым звуком, без ассоциаций.
The prevalent element that stands out to me in Stalker is how image is presented to us. As the plot follows a small collective of characters as they journey from point A to point B, surroundings play a large part in the narrative. We're never presented with an establishing shot throughout Stalker, which is curious as it's the most geographically tactile film Tarkovsky ever made. Rather than explore his themes from beyond, Tarkovsky explored them by introducing us within them. As our characters traverse through new individual areas, we're asked to move onward with them without question. But the way that Tarkovsky represents this space is just as important. Every shot within the film is a closed frame. Doors block full visions of rooms. Walls cut off the space. The edges of the frame are always confined by something, whether it's something actively surrounding the character or a restriction imposed by our perspective. The connotation is that there exists something more within the unseen space, especially considering that everywhere our characters traverse from our point of view is unseen. Even the supposed threat of the zone, in which Stalker overcomes through the throwing of the stone, is invisible. This idea is best exemplified in the scene just before our characters enter the zone. Tarkovsky typically shot his subjects from much further. However, Stalker employs much more close-ups than any other of his works, perhaps the most famous being here. The characters sit silently as they wait to enter the zone. The pressure of time is built as we linger on them, their vision hindered by the tight frame, wandering into the unknown. They're both static and moving at the same time. There's no relation of where they are, as it's not revealed to us. Our soul and our being become two separate things, as the material space in which our body inhabits is negated by the evolution of our soul. The characters must accept the idea of the zone as a physical space, when in reality, the zone is not physical as they would understand it. The camera only exacerbates this idea, and the movement of Tarkovsky's camera in Stalker is best described as encroaching. There's an atmosphere of building that permeates Stalker. We're conscious of the journey our characters are on and understand that they're heading to a place which has the potential to break the very equilibrium of life itself. As such, the camera's focus is a very strange one. Often the camera will zoom or track inwards towards the characters, bringing us intimately into their world. Often it will creep with such subtlety that it's barely noticeable.
Вас зовут писатель. Хорошо, а как зовут меня? Вас профессор.
If camera motion is to move us as viewers from one place to another, where is Tarkovsky taking us with this? Again, much like how time was examined in Mirror as micro and macrocosmic, the same is to be done in Stalker. Each individual scene tells its own story through the pressure it creates, but much like the man in the balloon from Andrei Rublev, everything becomes clearer once we see the grander picture. To truly comprehend the world of Stalker, one must examine not just the visual, but the audible also. The sounds we are presented with in Stalker are that which we've come to expect from Tarkovsky. The tranquil patterns of nature ring through our ears. However, here what we begin to question is whether the sound exists or not. Just as the professor receives a phone call from someone he knows whilst inside the zone, there is the possibility that, like the ocean, the zone manifests the soul of the person there. But there's also the option that they themselves are the ones manifesting this reality.
Я ведь в 2 шагах от того самого места. Ты меня слышишь?
The frames within Stalker are so dense, even though there's so little that's going on in them physically. As such, we ask ourselves to focus intently on that which does happen, and in doing so, we find large disconnections. Why does no one know who told the writer to stop moving?
Зачем вы?
Что? Зачем?
Зачем вы его остановили?
Why does the rock thrown down the hole not react until an unrealistically long time? And why is there the motif of Ode to Joy played at the beginning and end of the film? Sound in Stalker represents a spatial expression. For instance, the concept behind Ode to Joy was to invoke the destiny of humanity. However, when we hear it, it's played from a distance, from a source we never see, beneath the howling and rattling of a house. Ultimately, we don't know if this sound is diegetic or not. Perhaps it exists within the mind of our characters, just like the voice on the end of the phone, or like the threat of the zone, or like a place where all our wishes will come true. The sounds within Stalker and closing the frames of characters journeying into the unknown creates a world within Stalker that's infinite, allowing all space and everything within it to be never-ending. Stalker is the main protagonist and sits between two opposite poles of utter pragmatism from the professor and abstract truth from the writer. Much as we saw in Andrei Rublev a similar inner contradictory nature, in Stalker, this dichotomy exists between both of them. They both reject each other's premise, while equally wishing they could resolve some of their questions by posing some of the sensibilities of the other.
Но ведь человек пишет, потому что мучается, сомневается.
Stalker himself sits in the middle of this, hoping to deliver people happiness. He seems to have no goal aside from this. His duty is inherited, as though a truth has been revealed to him which he must expose to others. The sacrificial nature of Stalker comes with heavy religious connotation, and in fact the film can be read as a straight allegory for the nature of religion, but amongst other things, Stalker as a character is also incomplete, and he's only absolved of his disillusion towards the film's finale. The zone exists as the reality of Stalker himself. In his reality, this zone is prohibited to access, thus he guides people towards it. However, as we see within the zone, there's nothing there. Stalker imprints his reality onto the reality of the world, bringing it into physicality, making it in fact real. In the sequence where all three characters begin to dream, there's no distinction between when the dream begins and when it ends, if it even did either. The zone itself exists in a dreamlike state. Its aura is that it lives and breathes, moving as a slow drift, demanding respect like one would an authority figure.
Вы что?
Я же говорил, тут не место для прогулок. Зона требует к себе уважения, иначе она карает.
But these dreams, are they shared? Who do they belong to? We sense that all members have experienced at least something similar, as the perspective is never clarified to us. However, what's suggested is that of a great moment of spiritual clarity that has just occurred. If the real space was only accessible through the dreamscape, then the boundaries that were imposed upon us were self-imposed. On one side of the barrier is reality, and on the other side is the infinite. That barrier again being like water, permeable and irregular. As space is Tarkovsky's key theme, it's unavoidable to relate this with the plot device that although the room exists right in front of our characters, they must detour through a specific path in order to reach it. Though this cannot be reduced to a single meaning, it's evident that this acts as a subversion of the space around us as we know it, as a means for elevation through taking a path beyond our reality. Stalker is the film of Tarkovsky that benefits more than any of his others from repeated viewings. Although the individual sequences are so scarce, there's so much to unravel here. From when we enter the room of the zone, the temporal and spatial continuity of the film seem to fall apart, which in one sense is the film reaching exactly where it was meant to be. At the end of Stalker's voyage, he experiences a loss of faith. He questions the purpose of everything that he does, whether he even had a purpose to begin with. The writer discussed that he didn't even know what he didn't want to know. The professor attempts to destroy the room in the hopes that no one can abuse its power. Ultimately, regardless of the evidence they all witnessed, they progressed into the room with their answer already buried within them, as by the end, we never get to see the place in which one's wishes are met. It's left to stagnate within our own imagination, which is perhaps where it always resided. Our desires lay dormant within us all, ready to be accessed by some majestic leap of inspiration. Until then, they exist only in our dreams. Those things that are unique to you, that you cannot manifest for anyone else, as the purpose for existence is to imprint your own desires and dreams on the world around you. You create boundaries that must be purged, a realization that the unanswerable has already been answered deep within our soul. The wife of Stalker has a final monologue, where she seems to look into the camera as though talking directly to us.
Вы ведь, наверное, уже поняли. Он же блаженный.
The same way in the monologues of the professor and writer, they looked directly at us. Tarkovsky here has broken the boundaries between the life of our reality and the dream within the fiction. The world of Stalker is surrounded by fog, cutting off its notions of a physicality, that which we are privileged to possess. Yet their dreams still replicate our own. They still cry for their own ode to joy. There are no answers given in Stalker. As we return from the zone, we return to the sepia of our lives. The colour fades as the journey leads us back to our beginning. However, the final shot of Stalker shows his daughter reading a poem in her mind before looking at the glasses on the table as they start to move and the train rushes past once more. The glass falls but doesn't break. The train vibrates the entire room. We're left wondering whether the glass was magic, a dream, or just a train. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. Like the professor arguing with the writer, there's no outcome of resolution, but the endless yearning for one. The glass falls, and no matter what journey we undertake to discover its reasoning, we will always be left wondering. The understanding comes in the ethereal plane, in the balance of the pragmatic with the emotional, inside our own professor and our own writer, in the land that exists between sepia and colour. It's no surprise that a film like Nostalgia opens with a black and white shot of a rural Russian pasture, followed by the smog-filled landscape of Tuscany. Both share a geographic similarity to one another. Presenting them as such seems to indicate some state of affinity. The worlds of Italy and Russia become the structure for what is perhaps Tarkovsky's most untranslatable work, a film about what the title would suggest. However, the film Nostalgia follows not the nostalgia that we may ensue, but one of pestilence that wipes away the love of all things, a degree of Tosca, the untranslatable Russian word describing the experience of a deepest incomparable anguish felt in the soul. Nostalgia follows a Russian intellectual on his voyage to Italy. His research regards the Italian Renaissance, which he's only experienced second-hand in Russia. Upon his arrival in Italy, he becomes disinterested and longing for something more.
Ma di sicuro sono più vicina alla verità.
Our main character Andrei spends his time trapped in purgatory. he undergoes an existential crisis, outside of his comfort zone, unable to find a connection with anything around him. That which he's built so much of his life off back in Russia. The world surrounding Andrei is oniric. His state throughout the entire film is that of contemplation, thus the entire world is as opaque as possible.
Guardate, c'è il poeta russo.
We gaze at the world not through its inherent beauty as our protagonist may have anticipated, but through a metaphysical extension of the character's ennui. The world is Italy, but it's shaped by Russia. It's formed through the longing of our characters in Tarkovsky's homeland. Andrei wanted to experience Italy as he subjectively experienced Italy from afar. He placed his own perceptions onto a place, abstracting it in his own mind. However, the people around the monuments, which to him contain some great soul and meaning, don't see them as such. Those things make up their existence, and they form the truest idea of an elemental relationship. Andrei doesn't have this, and his sudden crisis is displayed in his absolute otherness toward the world he thought he knew so well. Tarkovsky in Nostalgia discusses a very subjective notion. His artistic journey of finding a new subjectivity is slightly abandoned in Nostalgia, as his techniques here are at their most rational. Rather than glimpsing at our protagonist from beyond this world and his own lens, Nostalgia is proactively from the perspective of Andrei, rarely diverging from him. As we will see, Tarkovsky is discussing many things much like the rest of his work. However, Nostalgia was his most focused to date, and thus when examined from the perspective of the other that is Andrei, the clarity of his themes would obviously emerge most from this perspective. Tarkovsky examines the pathos of cultural divides while simultaneously being so enamoured by them. A work and its people are innately formed by memory, by the heart and soul of a place and time that lingers eternally, shaping everything around it. Without this built-in experience, our art would never truly be understood, its nuance would be misplaced, and its context disregarded.
La poesia è impossibile tradurre, tutta l'arte così.
Much like Andrei Rublev and Stalker, much of what defines Andrei is his state of inaction. He's languished by the overwhelming melancholy buried in his soul, making his detachment from everything the only plausible solution in his heart. He chooses not to see the mural he originally intended to see. He refuses all advances from his translator Eugenia. In fact, everything that he does appears to be performed only as a matter of necessity. Andrei removes himself from all others, but becomes infatuated with one man, Domenico, a local man who was locked up for 7 years by his own family after spouting endlessly about an impending apocalypse. Andrei's encounter feels just as ethereal as anywhere else we've seen him. However, there's something more grounded than previous times with his meeting with Domenico. Perhaps it is again Tarkovsky's recurrent motif of running water. The currents crashing through a dilapidated building conjure this idea of death breeding life. The house and structure of Domenico's existence is falling apart at the seams, yet the hypnotic torrent of water suggests that there is a life source within his words, that his life is true, his vision is clear, and those who misunderstand him misunderstand life. It's funny as Tarkovsky actively avoided symbolism in his work, yet on the world of Domenico, we see the scrolling of 1 + 1 = 1. Just shortly after, he says this line:
Una goccia più una goccia fanno una goccia più grande, non due.
Perhaps this is because Andrei and Domenico are one in the same. Both the artist and madman coexist as one. Tarkovsky showed us the notion of struggle, as Andrei aimed to find the balance in life and art. To be able to find a more direct link is what most people strive for, and this answer that lies within our reach is personified through Domenico. In the opening scene at the church, Andrei remains outside, reminiscing over his family and life in Russia. Yet while Eugenia is still inside the church, she gazes at the painting, the camera gazing at it too, until we cut to a shot of Andrei again in Russia. This suggestion blurs the two realities. Andrei is in Italy dreaming of Russia. All the while he's in Russia dreaming of Italy. He holds this devastating longing to feel the sensation that only his homeland can evoke. All the while, he feels nostalgia for a time and place he's never even been in, as if both were visions of the other. There's a spiritual symbiosis indicated by the removing of time, place, reality, dream, and people. Is Tarkovsky discovering the universal oneness? Much like the discussion of breaking frontiers, it's through his own art that he attempts to do this. Find art that penetrates directly to the soul, bypassing all boundaries that would have made it inaccessible to a person. Nostalgia permeates the idea that life acts as a mirror, not in the way that it did in Tarkovsky's mirror, this time in the sense that there is something directly reflected back to you, and most likely that reflection is something that you are not willing to witness. We undergo personal journeys to then amend this internal discovery. Nostalgia is like Stalker in many ways. There is some idea of a zone. Whether it's a material place or not, there is some level of it being both. And in nostalgia, this zone remains, a place wherein all things internal and external exist in a mysterious ether.
Come donando l'ultima porzione di letizia, morire in levità e al riparo d'un tetto di fortuna.
The theme of dreams is very prevalent in nostalgia. It can be argued that they are at their most important in nostalgia than any other Tarkovsky film. Here the dreams are profoundly vivid, and like previous films have a distinct sense of repetition. In one of the dream sequences, Andrei lies on his bed as the camera moves beyond him to show his wife and Eugenia in a kind of embrace. The sound from the rain slowly peters away. This is certainly a dream. However, as we see in a later scene, Andrei talks to a girl that emerges from nowhere. A feather falls, linking it with a false memory from the beginning of the film. If that memory was false, then what does that make of this reality? The bodies of Eugenia and his wife become fused together. The reality of Andrei becomes one with his dreams. He sees himself as Domenico, and the landscapes of Italy and Russia become indistinguishable from one another. The culmination of such is a juxtaposition of the two major characters of the narrative, Andrei and Domenico. Domenico stands atop a monument, waxing about the fall of mankind.
Ascolta, in te, acqua, fuoco.
And in an act of protest, sets himself alight. The onlookers seem to be transfixed within their own realities, not one of this world, not one existing within the same paradigm as either Domenico or Andrei. Meanwhile, Andrei, in a poetic gesture, rather than setting himself alight, seeks to take a lit candle from one end of a bath to another. Both are opposite sides of the same coin, in a hope to reach some manner of universal catharsis. Tarkovsky said when speaking to Yankovsky regarding this candle sequence, that the purpose of the scene was to summarize the entire life of a human being from birth to death. For Andrei, that is exactly what it is. The purpose of his entire life led to this point. Whatever that greater purpose may be, is left to interpretation. However, I do not believe that it's one that's irrelevant. It would seem to me that Tarkovsky pleaded for us all to achieve our own purposes through a deeper connection with our own souls, to find what it is that truly makes us whole. In essence, all of Tarkovsky's shots held true to this philosophy of exemplifying a lifetime within one shot. These durational scenarios elucidate a deep introspective feeling on our behalf. The notion of time allows a shot to transform without the gimmick of cinematic intrusion. As we saw in Ivan's childhood, Tarkovsky began a much more intrusive director than he ended, but perhaps this shot out of his entire filmography is the purest Tarkovsky shot, that which achieved at an absolute the idea of capturing the human soul in its entirety. Tarkovsky would never return to Russia to make another film. He left Russia in the search for artistic freedom to make nostalgia, yet was still imprisoned by the internal he took with him. Nostalgia ends with a memory, a dream, or maybe a dying thought. Truthfully, it doesn't matter. Andrei sits on his homestead in Russia. The camera slowly zooms out, showing that the home is situated inside the Italian cathedral. Tarkovsky here makes that synthesis, that which we wish could be true. Yet regardless of the life that Andrei leads, there'll always be a yearning for a deeper connectivity with that he does not have. The camera sits distant from him, showing his isolation. Tarkovsky shot nostalgia in ways that many of our characters were isolated, shot on their own, demonstrating that if we are to be together, we must grasp onto something deeper that we can hold as a value for our life. The twin subsets that we currently maintain make us aversive of the modern world, birth us with an inherent dichotomy. Like staring into a mirror and not recognizing your reflection, it displays the duality of you as a human being, the struggle of finding and maintaining balance. Our sadness comes with the knowledge that not everything beautiful can be gained, and happiness doesn't exist without a sacrifice. The Sacrifice was Andrei Tarkovsky's final film. Whether he knew this or not, the result becomes a very profound viewing experience. The Sacrifice can be seen as the culmination of everything Tarkovskyan, consequently creating the ultimate catharsis of his entire work. If Tarkovsky aimed to show the elevation of mankind through more spiritual means, then The Sacrifice is the perfect swan song, showing his absolute rejection of the material world. The film follows Alexander, an ex-actor who is now seeking purpose in life as a lecturer and academic. Whereas many moments of Tarkovsky's work exemplify quietness, Alexander spends most of our introduction to him eulogizing over the concepts of life through deep philosophical means.
Ja, men tror du verkligen att människan skulle kunna finna på en konstruktion, en universell konstruktion, skapa en modell så att säga av den absoluta lagen, den absoluta sanningen?
He approaches his life in a very concrete manner, and others around him are aware of this. He's discovered much happiness in his life fortuitously, yet rants more about the folly of man. As we gradually discover more about him, we learn of his own resentment towards mankind as it's progressed without questioning the nature of its progression, a species whose greatest endeavour is to now exist in its own self-made epoch where words have become meaningless.
Words.
These ideas of mankind sabotaging its development, of the duality of being that can only achieve resolution through an inward movement, these notions are prevalent throughout all of Tarkovsky's previous works. The finale of Tarkovsky's artistic journey was to test the soul of mankind through its ultimate challenge, to face the destruction of all life itself. Later in the film, large rumblings shake Alexander's family home, and a news bulletin reveals that a war has broken out, likely to result in an impending nuclear holocaust. This shifts the entire perspective of Alexander as a being, as Tarkovsky takes us on his final meditation. Alexander is typified in The Sacrifice as a man whose entire life resides on only the material. He even suffocates his own offspring with the objectivity of life.
Och vad man än må säga så är metoden, systemet någonting stort.
Life has answers, and any inward doubt or self-discovery is pointless. Yet it's only when faced with the prospect of the end of the world that the reality of Alexander is revealed. He breaks down, he pleads to an omnipotent power to save his family and the world. In return, he would give everything that he is.
Jag ska göra allt vad jag har lovat dig.
Alexander in this moment abandons everything that he once was, realizing that all the words he said before were in fact spoken with an air of untruth, as this was the first time in his life that he's used his words to mean something viscerally truthful, so truthful that they can never be undone. The world becomes restored to the way it was, and brought back from the edge of destruction, yet Alexander is the only one who has any recollection of the event occurring at all. So what is to be done? There is one climactic scenario in the sacrifice at the end of the film, and everything that occurred prior becomes irrelevant. The events within could have occurred on any plane, whether it was a dream, a thought, a memory. What ultimately matters within the film is that there was a cause for the complete contradiction of Alexander as a human. Alexander realizes that the entirety of his life has been meaningless. He's led an existence which he himself did not believe. It required nothing from him to become the man he was. The key theme of the sacrifice lies in the film's title. Alexander wants to escape from the man that he is, only realizing it at the final moments of life as we know it. A feeling this powerful still demands self-liberation. He still holds one final opportunity at redemption. As he found the world dictated by idle talk, now was the time for action. In the finale of the sacrifice, Alexander takes a vow of silence, and in the final sequence of the film, we see him burn down the family home. There's a perversion in the manner in which Alexander commits to this act. He does so with a sense of urgency, as though his entire life has been building to this moment, something which will cleanse him of all his wrongdoings. But when we examine this climactic scene within the structure of the sacrifice, we see not only a culmination of Alexander, but the culmination of Tarkovsky's work. The burning of the home in the sacrifice becomes the only relevant moment of the entire film. It's an act which sweeps away every possible mode of reason and rationality. Nothing prior to this could adequately represent the end result. It is in fact the ultimate sacrifice. Tarkovsky's work was deeply rooted in his religious beliefs, and his Christian values undoubtedly weighed in on this most grand of gestures. This act is the ultimate in self-sacrifice, something which no one else can comprehend. The answers to such remain with you only, and you stand by your convictions to remain with them. You become dispensable on the physical level so that you may rise even further spiritually. We see that perhaps the act that was able to prevent the end of the world was Alexander lying with the witch after being told by his friend to do so. This may give us answers to why the world ceased to destroy itself, but it further expounds the notion of what a true sacrifice is. A sacrifice takes your soul in highest regard over the material, that which is only passed on as truth from others who believe so. Not the truth that you hold, but the truth that's intrinsic to all life. The dreams, the memories, and the thoughts are what define the self, and after rejecting them for so long, Alexander's acceptance emerges in a blaze both horrific and glorious. We've seen loss display through the infernos of the cabin in Mirror, as well as the martyrdom in Nostalgia, but these concepts are brought to their greatest fruition within the sacrifice. Stylistically, much of what was present within Tarkovsky's work remains in the sacrifice. It was less of doing something new and more of utilising the elements that made Tarkovsky to manifest the story he wanted to tell. Everything we've come to know of him is brought together for one final message here. However, working for the only time with Sven Nykvist, the longtime cinematographer of Ingmar Bergman, the lateral movement of the camera will become a distinguishing facet of the sacrifice and the final element added to Tarkovsky's repertoire.
Far till Maria. Men var försiktig.
Whereas Tarkovsky up to now was known for his slow zooms and encroaching camera, in The Sacrifice, parallel tracking is the feature which stands out most. Inside of the home, the lateral motion captures a great sense of space. As characters move from one area to the other, we move with them, and the composition completely changes with it. The space becomes a malleable feature, being communicated with the characters in a different light than we've seen before. The worlds of the characters can collide and join together, breeding two worlds simultaneously.
Nu är ju teatern faktiskt långt ifrån allting. Jag såg bara inte ut längre, förstår du det?
Only upon reaching the end of one's journey is our fate revealed to us, and until then the journey that takes us there is left in the ether to interpret. The future lies waiting for us. In many ways, it's simply the past manifested in front of our path. Just as the path in Mirror would have no reasoning to end in the position it did, as does the structure of The Sacrifice, as does life. The totality of The Sacrifice is a journey that had only one manner in which it could end, a rejection of all that's material to start anew. For as Tarkovsky shows us, when we don't grow spiritually, there's no reason to be at all. The Sacrifice was Andrei Tarkovsky's final film, dying just 7 months after the film's release. The Sacrifice is perhaps the clearest message that Tarkovsky ever discussed in his films. Perhaps he reached some solace within himself of all he was going to reject and all he was willing to accept. Just as Alexander in the film commits to his grand sacrifice, Tarkovsky committed his beliefs to celluloid. And just as all that defined Tarkovsky before, his final shot returns to the beginning of the film. A young boy, unchanged from the start, but perhaps with more knowledge lying within. Knowledge that will mould him imperceptibly in the future, just as I'm sure the work of Andrei Tarkovsky has done for so many of us. The work of Andrei Tarkovsky has had so much said about it, perhaps no more than by the man himself, and yet it still seems so mysterious. It's still rooted in the unexplainable, yet something which is so universally truthful. That seems to be the magic of his work. I can speak on a personal level when I say that Tarkovsky's work truly changed the way that I see cinema, the way that I see art. Never before had I seen someone capture an art that not only comes from within, but still can only be experienced from within. Andrei Tarkovsky was a filmmaker with deep sensibility, whose perspective relied on that which is far too often disregarded within our lives. Life requires absolute pragmatism to function. This is unquestionable. But what are you as a person? Are you what you know? Are you the thoughts that drift in your mind? Are you what others think of you? In the work of Tarkovsky, a person is all of this. They are the completion of every type of context, every type of perspective. They're a collage, and even in our own minds, we are such. Tarkovsky taught us to look inwards, for it may be the only place where the true you resides.
For the new beginning of the Cinema Cartography, we would like to thank our patrons and Mubi for sponsoring this video.
Mubi is an online streaming service that works just like a cinema. All the content is curated so it saves you from mindless scrolling. Mubi is also ahead, bringing fresh art festival and rare films for you. This month on Mubi you can check Tip Top by Serge Bozon, but there's always 30 perfectly curated films to watch on Mubi. For your extended free trial, go to mubi.com/cinemacartography. And for exclusive content from the Cinema Cartography, join our community on patreon.com/cinemacartography.